Hey, Ed Stetzer here. You are now at the Exponential Backstage. I'm Ed Stetzer, your host. Welcome to the Exponential Backstage. We've got several guests to introduce you in just a moment, but as we do, let me tell you a couple things. First, we want to encourage you. Brooks is going to put up, he's our producer here, he's going to put up a copy of a graphic that lists some of the places where actually you can connect with our Exponential speakers. Many speakers that I'll be announcing in just a moment are speaking at these locales. We call these our regional conferences. You can see them. Well, DC, these are all coming up. DC, SoCal, Bay Area, Houston, Chicago, and New York, which we'll specifically be talking about in just a moment. So the Exponential Conference, of course, many of us think of as Orlando, but now with the regional conferences global as well. This gives us an opportunity to kind of have a backstage conversation with speakers and connectors in and around the themes that we're talking about here today. My name is Ed Stetzer. I'm broadcasting you here from the Send Institute at the Billy Graham Center. We actually do church planting, think tanking, and research to increase capacity and make a greater gospel impact. So I do want to welcome Drew, Jordan, and Paul, and we'll share just a little bit about them each in just a moment. And matter of fact, let me just do that. Let me just do their bios so we know who these amazing guests are. Drew, who I asked to pronounce his name, and now I wasn't paying attention, is Hyun?
Hyun, yeah.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you, Drew. Church planter and pastor of Hope Church Midtown, as well as founding pastor of Hope Church New York City, which is a family of diverse churches. He's the co-founder of the New York City New City Network, a network of urban churches as well. He loves cities, ESPN, naps, and finds a restful Sabbath when all three of these come together. He lives in New York City with his wife, Christina, 2 children, and the author of No Books is actually what's listed in his bio, because he's actually been living out the ministry while others have been writing about it. So happy to serve you in that way. Jordan Rice is the lead planter of Renaissance Church in Harlem. His steps to planting included leaving his legal practice and church planting residency in New York City. He's a former fellow of the Redeemer City to City. Since 2013, Jordan and Jessica, his wife, have been building a diverse Christian community in Harlem. So we'll get to know him in just a little bit more. Jordan, so glad you're here. And Paul Andrew is a planter and pastor of Liberty Church in New York City, where he and his wife, Andy, began in 2010. Liberty Church has multiple communities across the city and beyond, multiplying through the Liberty Foundation, planning globally and more. And he's born in Australia, now lives in New York City, he and Andy are raising their children there as well. Those of you who went to the Exponential in Orlando, I went through a series of hero makers, and actually Paul was one of the pictures I put on the screen, and I mentioned him, as was Drew. So sorry, I kind of feel bad that we didn't include Jordan. Maybe we need to
That's cool.
include Jordan next time. Jordan, no pressure on you, man, but
Not at all.
Not at all. Jordan, a kind of random question. Why, what's the picture behind you? What's that thing behind you?
That is our Renaissance logo, with the faces of people in the community.
Dude, I love that. That is so very, very cool. Well, the topic today is actually going to be around the focus on multiplication thinking. Depending on time, we'll even talk about some about permission giving. 2 topics are 5 of the essential practices of hero making from the book Hero Maker, 5 essential practices for leaders to multiply leaders. The 5 practices are multiplication thinking, permission giving, discipleship multiplying, gift activating, and kingdom building. We're going to talk today specifically about the move to multiplication thinker with 3 leaders who've actually headed that direction. Instead of thinking the best way to make a biggest difference is through your leadership, instead it's to multiply other leaders. The model of Jesus, obviously, before us, when he said greater things, you probably weren't going to do miracles greater than Jesus, but again, the greater things were the multiplication of the ministry that came from that as well. Let's just jump right in, because we want to jump into our dialogue. Let me remind you, if you're watching on Facebook, do me a favor right now, hit like and share so other people can hear from the wisdom that we're about to have discussion around. And furthermore, if you're at the Exponential site, there's a chat window you can open. You can dialogue with us. We are taking questions both from the Facebook live chat and from the chat window at the Exponential site. So let's jump right in. And again, in the Hero Maker series, we've been talking with leaders. We've got a whole series of these webcasts, guys, and looking at 5 essential things. Today, we're continuing the conversation, talking to Drew, Paul, and Jordan, right? A couple things in common. They're planting and multiplying churches. They're all 3 doing it in New York City. As Hamilton says, the greatest city in the world, but it's not. Chicago is, but it's a great city. And these guys have a lot to teach us. So let's start with you, Drew. Who were some of the people who've spoken to your life, hero makers for you as you're now leading out ministry in New York City?
Yeah, I would say the church before we started Hope, New Life Fellowship, which is in Elmhurst, Queens. I'd say the two that stand out to me, although there are so many who have been hero makers. One is Jim Owens, who was a longtime mentor and who I was a direct report to. He was someone who continued to empower, give permission, and invested deeply in me. And of course, Pete and Jerry Scazzaro, who is the founding pastors there, invested so deeply and invited us into their lives, and certainly opened up opportunities, and really with this eye towards wanting to invest beyond themselves. So those are the two that stand out to me.
Of course, Pete's the author of, I think it was just Peter wrote it, but it's the most emotionally healthy church, and really been ministered to a lot of people through that as well. Okay, so let's continue. Let's ask the same question to Jordan. What about for you, Jordan?
My answer is actually a little bit. So one of them is a guy who did prison ministry. I did prison ministry at Sing Sing for years, and he was the first person to really pour into me and to release me way before I was ready or felt ready to do things. He was trying to give away influence, and he was trying to give away authority and trying to give away leadership at a really rapid pace, and that did so much in my life. Is that my computer doing that?
Yeah, I think we get some sort of feedback. So if you wouldn't mind, I want to continue your answer in just a second. If you can see if there's a way to address that, we'll work towards that. Let's go to Paul. And Paul, let's talk a little bit about you. Same question.
Yeah, I think one of my more recent heroes since moving to New York, of course, I pulled alongside some incredible movements here, including City to City and what Tim Keller and the Redeemer family have done. And
now, who is this Tim Keller? Tell us. I'm not really familiar with him. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah, he's got a big dream and a lot of potential, you know.
Yeah. He struggles, but maybe he'll get there.
But what I've loved about Tim, of course, Tim's no stranger to many people watching this broadcast, but what I've loved about Tim, come to admire, is, it's not that unusual for a pastor of a large church and a movement of churches to have a vision for planting churches. But what I do think is unusual, and really to me is multiplication thinking, is that he has sown in every way time, energy, and finance extensively into planting in his own backyard. And I think around the world, you find lots of leaders who, if you say you want to plant a church, they're excited for you to plant anywhere but down the road.
Yeah.
But what I've loved about Tim is he's focused the lion's share of their resources on impacting his own backyard, his own city. And I think that takes a big kind of a leader.
Yeah, it really does. There's an old expression that wouldn't work, in New South Wales, because different labeling, but it's start a church in another state. That's all for God's grace and glory. But start a church in my backyard, that's another story. And by the way, did you come straight from Oz to New York City, or were there some?
Yeah, we did. We moved 8 years ago. And
yeah. Who you hanging with in Australia before you came here?
I was part of Hillsong family. So that's where I came to Christ, even before it was Hillsong, actually. That was my home church back in the Hills Christian Life Center days, and then stepped out, planted in the States with the help of the Association of Related Churches. So.
Okay, an art guy. And now a fascinating journey. Okay, good deal. Well, we're super excited that you're here and in the States, because, there's no need in Australia. Just come here to New York City.
We're honored to be part of it. It's incredible.
Plenty of need in plenty of places, for sure. All right, so when you kind of look at your own ministries, all of you have sort of been drawn to multiplication thinking. Matter of fact, each of you in your bios has some sort of reference to they're investing in this movement or planning through this movement or connected in some way. You've really modeled this, Drew, and I want to go back to you. I'll kind of move around, and don't be it's a problem to jump in on if you want to add something somebody else said. But let me go back to Drew first. Who helped you understand the power of multiplication thinking? Where did that come from in your life, Drew?
I think Paul had mentioned Tim Keller. I think he's been like an incredible influence on us here in the city, just thinking through how, even the church he leads is simply one church amongst millions of people here in the city. And so the number that kind of captivates our attention is 8.5 million. And of course, 8.5 million there's no way that our little church, which seats about 150 people, could reach that many. And so I think the view that we all need each other in this kingdom movement, that it's not about kind of me or my own local church, but it's rather about what God can do through the entire city. And so I think Tim has been instrumental in getting us to all think through that. And so I'd say him. And then I think for me as well, I think reaching the city, but also for me, realizing my own kind of, I've gone through 2 different seasons of burnout. And I just realized, like, man, whenever I get into a season of wanting to do things on my own, I realize the way more fruitful thing would be to build a ministry that would last beyond me. And so that's kind of what I've been intentionally thinking about, more so because of my own shadow side, which tends to be so self-focused. So yeah.
Good word. Jordan, I think maybe your mic is back with us, I hope.
Hopefully. Is it?
See
how are we sounding? Sounding pretty good so far?
No, I think
feedback?
so. Yeah, so go ahead and weigh in on the same question. What helped you understand the power of multiplication thinking, and maybe some ways, how are you trying to live that out through the ministry?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll hop back on the Tim Keller bandwagon. Part of my call to ministry was realized at a talk that Tim gave in 2008 called God Loves Cities. And that really revolutionized the way I even saw ministry, in the sense of not that God wanted to build a great church, that God really wants to build great cities, and God's love for cities. So that was really instrumental in me thinking through that. And it's really been helpful for my soul and my character to think about ministry in the sense of what God is trying to do in Harlem, what God is trying to do in New York City, as opposed to what God is doing through my church. Because I get so myopic when I'm just thinking about my little tribe, my little church doing, whatever. There's 500,000 people in Harlem alone. And, our capacity is minuscule compared to that need. So that's been really helpful for me. And we run a lot with the Orchard Group guys and trying to think through how do we mobilize our churches to work together in reaching the city, that 8.5 million that Drew was talking about. So that's been really probably my biggest influence.
It's good. For a lot of people, Harlem Harlem, just the word brings to mind different things to different people. That's really not in many ways what Harlem is today or whatever. I mean, how would you describe where you are now? Tell us about the community. You obviously love it. Tell us why you love it.
I love it for nostalgic reasons. Also, I love what Harlem was and what Harlem is and what Harlem will be. And I grew up 20 minutes from Harlem playing basketball here in the 90s. And it's a much different neighborhood than what it was in 95. But on one end, on a Sunday, I was leaving church. On one street, Frederick Douglass Boulevard, there's like people jogging, walking their dogs, eating brunch outside of the cafe. And literally I was walking one avenue over to 7th Ave, Adam Clayton Powell, and there's a woman smoking crack on the stoop.
Yeah.
And so you literally it's a tale of 2 cities. So you have doctors and lawyers and artists and culture, but you also have the largest income gap in the city. Yeah. It exists in Harlem. So you have people who are extremely low income, and then you have multimillionaires all doors down from each other, not even on opposite streets, but just one building could be a $4.5 million brownstone, 2 doors down could be Section 8 housing. So it's an incredibly diverse socioeconomically place, but it's the greatest neighborhood in Manhattan for sure.
Nice,
easily.
Nice. And I'm jumping ahead, but I'm interested. I grew up on the other side of the city and then outside of the city. And, when I lived there, my Irish Catholic family would have very strong feelings and comments about Harlem.
Oh yeah.
And so I'd love to hear a little more. How are you seeking to, or are you even able to build some of the bridge across some of the people, from the 2 people you mentioned, one smoking on a stoop, on a step, one jogging and sitting at a cafe, been able to bridge some of that?
Yeah, that's been a core value of ours from the very beginning, diversity, and not just ethnically, but also socioeconomically. And that's been a pillar of ours that we've built our church around. And it radically attracts and radically repels people all in the same breath. But yeah, that's been something that we've focused on from the very beginning. In our first gathering, we had people from the projects and people who were working at Goldman Sachs. And wow. That's been our community.
Okay, I got to come and see this. I'm going to be there. When am I going to be there? Next June, doing a seminar. So I got to come and see what God's doing. All right. So I apologize to Paul and to Drew. I just immediately got to hear more from Jordan, but I got to hear more from Paul. But Paul, here's a rule going forward for all of us. we're going to avoid two words. One of the words is Keller, the other word's Tim. So moving forward, without any references to Tim Keller, because he is the fourth member of the Trinity, it appears, but without any references to Tim Keller, Paul, I mean, what helped you understand? Because really, I mean, that's even a different stream from where you come. What helped you see apply some of the power of multiplication?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we connected up with the Association of Related Churches, and that was great for us. You know, I'm so grateful for where I came to Christ and a couple decades of the heritage that I had in the Hillsong family, but also, to be honest, stepping out and planting in New York City as my wife and I, who nobody knew, we really needed somebody to teach us, you know, kind of church planting from the ground up. And so people like, you know, Chris Hodges at Church of the Highlands were great for us. And just thinking about what it is to so generously, you know, these churches where, to be honest, I mean, they're established huge churches, but genuinely for, so to speak, the little guy. And I think we were very grateful for the way that they not only embraced us, but equipped us. And as a result of that, you know, we've been able to multiply again and again and again, you know, churches not only in the New York City area, but in other cities as well, out from that. In a relatively short amount of time, I think that, you know, we really saw the power of the local church. And then, of course, intersecting that with Exponential and, you know, thinking multiplication and thinking generationally, it's been a great combination for us.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued too, though. Of course, I know ARC pretty well. I remember I got a text from Sarat like yesterday, yelling at me about something, which means we're friends. And you know, it's hard to describe movements. You know, life-giving churches, but those of us outside the movement might say, you know, moderately charismatic, spirit-filled kind of focus. And been very successful in many cities. You know, we think of hubs, if you will, Birmingham, Alabama, and Charleston, South Carolina. Neither of them are New York City.
Right.
And so we tend to see more larger launches with ARC. And again, I'm talking in general. My guess is you didn't have 250 people at your first service. Maybe I'm wrong. So how did you engage kind of the ARC multiplication ideas in New York City? A city that doesn't seem naturally going to be attracted to some of what you would see in Birmingham or in Charleston. I don't know Birmingham as well. I've preached at Seacoast, so that might be my case frame of reference.
Well, I definitely think there was a lot of contextualization that was needed. I think we had to focus on the principles rather than the practices. They had me share on a session just recently at the conference they have called, the session was, you know, launch strong in any context. And I said, well, we have to define strong. Yeah. So, you know, one of the comments that I made was just for us, we're probably thinking when we say strong, we mean sustainable. And there's a lot of ways that you can approach that. I think it'd be fair to say that we're probably not, you know, straight down the middle as a typical ARC model in maybe a suburban or even a Bible Belt type of a context. I don't think it's easy to launch a church anywhere. I probably think it looks a bit different when you take principles like the ARC that probably were developed in a different context and take them out to a place like New York. But for us, the principles have been effective.
Yeah, but I love that they kind of went straight up with it and gave you a seminar that's kind of the elephant in the room. You know, how do you launch strong in that as well? So when you went public, and what did it look like for you? Did you have 50 people? Did you have, what did you have?
Well, our launch Sunday back in January 2011 was 150 people, actually.
Which is big for New York City. But then, of course, you brought all your friends and your mom and your mom's friends. So what'd you have week 2?
Right. So we settled in at about 110 people. Yeah. And we launched on the coldest day that winter. And of course, we launched the same month as my home church launched a little church you might have heard of called Hillsong New York.
I've heard of it. It's struggling.
Well, yeah, they're doing good. Yeah. So, you know, I was grateful for people to help us lay some of those foundations and basic, you know, for church.
Do you ever want to just shout at the top of your lungs and say, Drew, turn off your phone, man. We're having a conversation here. Gee whiz. So you ever just want to shout at the top of your lungs to Hillsong New York City, I'm an Australian. He's not.
Yeah, the only problem is nobody cares that you're from somewhere else when you live in New York City.
That's true. But it's so cool. I mean,
got an accent, you know.
If you just talk, you know, if you read the phone book, we think you're smart. If you got an accent that's not the British accent. But anyway, another story for
I wish it was
day. Super. So again, so glad you're here and love having this conversation. I want to move it around a little bit back to Drew. Drew, you've planted this church, and then pretty quickly, this is one of the reasons I put your picture on a screen at the Orlando Exponential Conference. Did you know that though, or did that surprise you when your face was up there?
It was a little bit of a surprise. Yeah.
I like to surprise people.
Yeah.
So at what point, I mean, you planted this church. Give us a little bit of church biography. and then you start planting other churches. I mean, when are these? I mean, because you're still just a baby church, babies having babies. Tell me about that and why.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started, we did start with a vision to be a family of diverse churches. And I think it was because we, had read and learned from folks like this one prominent pastor in New York.
Tom, you can refer to him as Tom Keeler.
Yeah, and others, and so we already had that vision. But I think when we first launched, so we launched with about maybe 125 people, and then the second week we had about 70. And then we kind of just slowly grew from there. And what we said was, if we grow to a certain size, we were looking at maybe 200 or so, that what we would do is, if we found a called leader and we felt like the Spirit was moving in a different neighborhood, then what would it look like for us to remain kind of family, closely connected as family, but also empower a group of people to go on mission into a different neighborhood. And so by that first Easter, we reached kind of the number that we were looking at. And so
here's the, I mean, we kind of, I'm not asking everyone to be swinging their numbers around, whatever, but it does help for context. You say your number you were trying to reach. So what was that?
Yeah, well, for us, it was about 200 folks.
Okay, so you had about 200 people, unusual for New York City, but I mean, again, it might not be, someone's Oklahoma, they're like, oh, okay, 200. So you get to that point. Were you waiting to get to that point to multiply? Or was there something going on? Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, because our main goal was not necessarily the model, but how can we continue to reach more people?
Okay.
So for us, we were in a space that only seated about 110 people.
Okay.
And so we were running 2 services. We were thinking, okay, do we do a third service at a non-optimal time, or do we, move to a bigger facility? But moving to a bigger facility would have cost us kind of exponentially more here in the city.
Yeah.
And so at that point, we said, well, what if we tried to live into this vision? And at that point, there was a buddy named Christian Hernandez, who's just an amazing pastor and who's now the lead pastor of the founding church that was started. We put together a plan of just like, well, if we have the leaders right now in our midst, what if we were to go for this kind of multiplication move and see what would happen? And so that was kind of the early seeds of it. And we learned a lot in those early days. We felt like we multiplied too fast. Looking back, without certain systems in place, without kind of a real culture building type of environment for us, as well as with kind of just thinking through a financial model. But we learned a ton those first 2 years. And then ever since then, we've just kind of continued to drill down with culture, doing things in a healthy way, in a very organic kind of way of empowerment. And so for us, actually, the word I think that fuels more of what we're doing is not necessarily multiplication, but it's more empowerment.
Okay.
When we come around people that we deeply invest in, when we empower them to go ahead and lead and to start these new movements, so we're much more people driven in that sense than we are like putting together a map and saying, hey, we're going to go for that area or that area. We really want to get around people who share a common culture and our heart, and we want to empower them like crazy when it comes down to it.
I like it. So give me a timeline. So you showed up there what year?
Well, 2012 was when we launched our first church.
And came from where did you come from for that?
I was at New Life, and then we linked in with the Evangelical Covenant Church denomination, which have been just a huge blessing. And
yeah, good, super people. And matter of fact, new presidents as a friend, and church planting president. You have the former head of church planting is now the head of the Evangelical Covenant Church. Lots of good people. We've had Michelle Sanchez speak at some events. So you go there 2012. You plant Church 1.
September
and then when does the second one come?
So the second one was launched in the spring of 2014.
2014, and then what? Give me from 14 till now. What else has been going on?
And then in fall of 2014, we planted in Midtown, and then we planted a church in East Queens. I forget the years, maybe 2016, and then Long Island in 2016, and then Brooklyn in 2017, and then Brooklyn and Jersey City in 2017, and then in 2018, the West Side and the East Village launched.
I really want to encourage you to avoid New Jersey, just in general.
We were trying. So
the Lord just forced you to go there. everything's legal in New Jersey. That's a line from Hamilton. But anyway, where on Long Island?
It's now they're recently moving down to, I don't know what section. They used to be in New Hyde Park.
Nice.
And then they were moving in different neighborhoods. And then
New Hyde Park, like 4 miles from where I live. But anyway.
Oh, yeah, wow.
So, okay, cool. Sorry. So it's not about me though. It's about you. Enough about me. What about my childhood do you want to talk about? No, just kidding. All right. So here's some questions we want to go to. And I really want to remind people, if you're watching on Facebook Live, take a moment, click like and share. and so that people can know about this free resource that we're talking about. We have 3 guests today. Drew, Hyun? Help me one more time. Okay, good. I got it right that time. Jordan Rice, Paul Andrew, pastors all in New York City, all also involved in what we're doing at Exponential. Brooks, put up for just a second so they can see where people will be, and they'll be speaking. I'm actually going to ask them a question because 2 of you are speaking at the New York. Jordan and Paul are speaking in the New York regional, and Drew's already, I think, engaged in Orlando. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But we also have your questions. I want to ask you to drop your questions in Facebook Live. We'll pick them up and share them with our panelists. And you can open the chat box at the Exponential site and follow along with us as well. So we've already got some questions that are coming in. So let's jump right in. And this can be really from anyone. This is, can you provide some examples of empowerment in ministry? Since we just heard from Drew, let's go to Jordan, if that's okay. What are some ways, in fact, let me nuance that question a little more. Exponential folks talk about leading with a yes, giving people permission. And the question is, how can you provide examples of empowerment in ministry? So starting with you, Jordan, and then go right to Paul and then Drew, we'll just go with all 3 of you in a row. How do you do that? Give us some examples of empowerment, saying yes, leading with a yes.
Well, we view our Sunday gathering as really, really important. And I don't know if Drew and Paul are like me, but every Sunday feels like, oh man, I need to be preaching this text. This is like a really important week. So leading with a yes means allowing our leaders, our residents, to kind of make messes in our pulpit a little bit. That they're trained and they're preaching good, biblical, godly stuff, but they're not necessarily. We're giving them space to grow in our pulpit, to refine their preaching, particularly preaching to people who are not Christian. So many people, they'll preach a fantastic sermon if it were to a room full of Christians, but refining their craft. And what that means is a lot more work to kind of refine things, but also just a freedom for people to be able to kind of make mistakes and to fall upwards and to just have the platform to actually work out that preaching muscle and what it looks like to preaching to non-believers. So that's something that we do. And we spend a good deal of time leading up to the sermon. And then also after the sermon, kind of really looking at it from the lens of, hey, this is, if I'm not a Christian, this might be how I would have heard this. And they don't learn outside of preaching. So just for me, who loves to preach, this means taking my preaching down by probably about an additional 8 Sundays a year to make room for our upcoming planters to be able to preach.
Okay, good. Paul, to you.
Yeah, I think 2016 was a big year of empowerment for us. We had 3 communities. We call them the campuses communities. I think that better describes what we're trying to do. But between Manhattan and Brooklyn, we just adopted a church plant on the Upper West Side that became a Liberty from a friend's church in Florida. And, 1 year period, 3 of our either current or recent pastoral staff said they felt called to plant new works. And at the same time, we were working towards planting 4 new communities. And so it was sort of one of those pivot points to decide, what kind of leaders are we going to be. And so these 3 new churches began out from that decision. I felt years ago, the Holy Spirit said to me this thing that has always stuck with me. He said, you can hold people loosely without treating them lightly. And I think that's been one of our leadership tensions. I want to value people. I want to treasure them, pour into them, but I also want to hold them loosely. But one of the fun stories that came out of that was that actually one of the planters that went was my brother-in-law. He went to Southern California. He had a vision for really viral, multiplying, micro churches. And actually he's done very well down there. So here's the community he had pastored here was a daughter church, had been planted. We planted one, and then 8 months later that planted another in Manhattan. But he then has gone on to plant a 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation church out from that, 2 in California, and then now 1 into Colorado. And I think when you zoom out, the decision point to be empowering or even just releasing, the fruit that came from that is, it's inspiring. But I think if we hold people tightly, you don't see that.
Nice. I mean, just drilling in a little bit, Paul. You call them Liberty churches.
Yeah.
Okay. And I know some of them are even already now overseas.
That's right.
So how give us like Drew did, Give us a little timeline. I mean, you planted when,
Yeah.
and then when you start sending out these churches.
Yeah, so we landed summer of 2010, gathered some people, did some monthly gatherings, launched the original one in downtown Manhattan, January 2011. Fall of the same year, we launched a second one in Union Square in Manhattan. We regrouped for a few years and then planted in downtown Brooklyn, would have been 2014. Along the way, we were releasing a couple of people to plant new works and start new churches as well. We've planted right about as many new churches as we have Liberty communities. And then we adopted a church on the from Christ Fellowship in Florida. We adopted a church on the Upper West Side that became a Liberty community over a period of time. And then actually in the last 12 months, we planted, besides the new works I mentioned a minute ago, we planted 4 Liberty communities. So one in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, with the help of the City to City Network. One in North Beach, downtown San Francisco in California. One in St. Pete in Florida. And then one in Manzini in Eswatini in Southern Africa. So most of those were a 3 or a 4 year journey. It sort of sounds like a lot in a short amount of time. And it was. We went from 4 communities to 8. We went from 1 city to 4 and all the complex stuff that comes with that. We've been on a steep learning curve, let's just say that, but it's been awesome too.
It sounds like a lot because it is a lot. And let me just help you clarify that, though. I appreciate the Australian humility. You don't want the tall poppy syndrome to come in and somebody sort of knock that down. But I do think, I mean, if church planners are listening now and they say, I'm going to adopt some of the strategies that I'm actually seeing mentioned here, I'm going to do, what Jordan, Drew, and Paul have said. I mean, we'd see a substantial, impactful planting movement actually take place as well. So kind of fascinating to do that as well. All right. So to you, Jordan, if you can answer that question, which is kind of ways you've said yes and ways that you've got to multiplication. And then I'm going to go with you with another one in just a minute that someone's come in. So first to you, and then I want to follow up to you, Jordan.
Okay. Did you want me to answer that question about empowerment?
Oh, I got it backwards, didn't I? I mean, so Drew, go ahead and answer that question about empowerment.
Yeah, I would say, I think one of the words that I think about as I was kind of in the church planting journey was building a culture of blessing.
Okay.
I think what I've noticed about, what I was noticing was that a lot of young pastors that I knew, oftentimes if they wanted to start new work or if God had given them a certain kind of vision, 2 things often were lacking. One was a blessing, just a culture of like, hey, I bless you and I believe in you. And the second thing was financial resources. And so part of it was, I felt like for myself, I thought whenever I have an opportunity to provide either of those things, that's something that I want to do. And so empowerment that really was kind of fueled by a culture of blessing. Right now, in terms of how we empower folks, we do a residency that we do, and we have ongoing meetings amongst each of our church planters to help build culture. And then kind of out of that, we want to help sustain them through continually providing resources and such. And so for us, it's kind of an ongoing culture of empowerment that's birthed through friendship. So for us, we I think multiplication is kind of the end goal, but it starts with a certain kind of culture. And the culture that we're trying to build is really a culture of humility, generosity, and blessing. If we can continue to kind of live into that, then we realize it's not about us, it's about giving ourselves away. So that's what we're constantly trying to cultivate here amongst our family of churches, I'd say.
Love that. And then you're Evangelical Covenant, and we know that Paul is affiliated with ARC. So let me come to Jordan. I wonder who you're affiliated with. I'm guessing it must be something Pentecostal, the way you just started waving your arms around in the move of the Spirit over there.
It is. Or, the Spirit was calling me.
Yeah, or you have a motion sensor light that turned off. So
I do. I have both. It's actually both. We're with Orchard Group. So I was a fellow with Redeemer City to City, and they kind of did a lot of the training. And Orchard Group for us is our tribe in New York, to really just help us to think about multiplying churches in cities all over the world.
So Orchard is, of course, part of the Restoration Movement. Is that your background or more connected? Just
no, okay. No. I grew up in an old school Black Baptist church in Yonkers. So
nice.
I've never even heard of the Restoration Movement until about 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, well, meet the Stone Campbell family. So they're a fascinating bunch. And I would say one of the great things about Orchard Group is it used to be the Go Ye Chapel mission.
Listen, that's a mouthful.
It is. So Jordan, how did you go ye in your chapel mission? But the question coming in here is, what kind of patterns have you recognized taking place in initiating some of these churches that you're seeing planted?
Say that one more time. What kind of
patterns have you seen in the initiating of some new successful church plants? Are there things you're seeing that are in common? When we do this and we do this, we see something have a greater impact?
Definitely. I love what Drew said about the culture of blessing. When you see churches who are willing to their own quote unquote detriment, bless and give and sacrificially give their time, their resources, both financially. So I've seen the healthiest churches launch from all the healthiest churches. And I've seen very unhealthy situations, some outliers, but certainly some unhealthy situations from people who are lone rangers and aren't really supported. At Renaissance, we once a year raise money to just send out churches. We're now supporting 3 church plants financially, and it's a big part of our budget to go out of the door every year, and also to let people go shopping in our refrigerator, to preach and to send people so that people can have their own vibrant churches. And I know what it feels like. So my experience with church planting was my resident church really was trying to hold on too tightly to me. And when I didn't want to do a campus, they really kind of dropped me like a bad habit, to be honest. And that meant that we started with just me and my wife, and Orchard Group was very gracious to us financially, but we had no people. And I know what that did to my soul internally to go into hyper gathering mode. So we've tried to do the opposite, to say, and what we've seen in a lot of healthy churches now is when you have a collection of churches come around an infant church and really supply them with the seeds of success to a gifted leader. That's just something that I've seen when you see a couple of churches coming around one leader to bless and to send, both financially and with some key leaders and some people. You've just seen things more organically just take off.
Well, I'm intrigued by the fact that there seems to be a shift going on. Where maybe 10 years ago, we would find the independent entrepreneurial buy alone planter. You plant alone. The hip insider language is you parachuted into there. But it's interesting that all of you sort of have spoken to the network or the denomination. Drew's case is a denomination. And as one who's actually believed in the power of networks and denominations, it seems that we're coming back around, that we need a team. We need some partners. We need some friends on that. Paul, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the ARC catchphrase is "Don't do ministry alone." And I think, we're pretty good as preachers. We oftentimes will, we'll preach that to our community. He who isolates himself isn't wise. But honestly, a lot of pastors do the very same thing. They end up isolating themselves. They haven't got relationship. There's no, and oftentimes that sets us up for danger in all sorts of ways. We don't have the safety in the multitude of counsel. We don't have somebody watching our back. We don't have somebody in our world that can ask us the important questions or the follow-up questions. And to me, that kind of intersects with what we've been talking about here with a culture of empowerment. Because if I was to say what's the one pattern I've noticed in church planting churches, if you want to put it that way, is the security of the leader. I think there's a lot to, am I fundamentally secure? Because no matter how much I say, I want our church to plant new churches, if I am insecure, it's very hard to be releasing, very hard to be empowering, very hard to give yes to things that maybe aren't squarely the vision that I have in mind or what I feel called to plant. And so I think there's an aspect of like really, really doing the soul work ourselves as leaders and being comfortable. That enables us to create that kind of a culture Drew is speaking to.
Yeah, I think Drew would echo in some ways Pete, who would talk about that emotionally healthy ability to kind of walk in that way. Drew, let me ask you to follow up on that, but kind of also to broaden it. One of the questions has come in from one of our viewers, and let me give you this last chance. If you want to ask a question, go to Facebook Live, leave a comment or question there, or go to the chat room at Exponential site. But one of our viewers asked, we're a large established church, 85 years, who wants to start a multiplying movement. Where does it start? I mean, again, it's not, in the Bible, there's like the Jerusalem church, which never sends out anybody to plant a church. If someone shows up from the Jerusalem church, you're in trouble. They're there to check on you. And they were like people from Jerusalem, But the Antioch church kind of became this sending church. So a lot of times new churches become the places where new churches are planted. All three of you are a testament of that. But talk to me about, are there things that you've seen? You're in a denomination, Evangelical Covenant. It's an older denomination. What would you see would be necessary for an older church to get involved?
Yeah, I would say, again, I think a lot of it deals with culture. So yeah. I think a lot of times one of the biggest hindrances to people wanting to invest in something outside of, their thing is often fear. And so I think really being able to see with new eyes of faith, and to make moves where we begin to put our money where our mouth is, right? So if I do want to start a multiplying movement, that's actually going to cost something, and it costs sending people, it costs sending money, it costs being willing to bless so that someone else and something else can flourish. And I think that's the kingdom mentality, though. I think that's what the kingdom of God is like, is that when we give ourselves away, that those things begin to reproduce in ways that would flourish and resurrect and bring new life. And so I'd say for an older established church that wants to do that, I would say start identifying people and put money where your mouth is as it relates to supporting new works and new churches. And I think there's so many denominations and networks nowadays who are trying to spur on some of these established churches toward that end. So the folks who can come alongside are there. It's a matter of now being able to take the step and just pick up the phone and call and say, hey, can you help us multiply? Can you help us be a multiplying type of church? So
nice. A quick follow-up that just came in for you.
Yeah.
What have you found successful in keeping your family of churches connected together as they grow?
Yeah, for us, again, on the front end, it's the residency, which is a real drill down on culture. So over this next year, we have 6 people going through our residency, who some of them may plant churches, some of them may not. But nonetheless, it's really a building of a sense of fraternity amongst us. And then we have ongoing meetings and gatherings for our pastors, where we're constantly praying together, updating each other, sharing human resources, sharing financial resources, and trying to do things as much together as we can. And so for us, a lot of what we do is so relational. So a lot of our connectivity, a lot of the multiplication initiatives that happen, so much of it is happening relationally. And so that's kind of what we do. And now what's great about it is something that people might not know about our family of churches, that each of our churches are actually financially and legally independent. And so we are not kind of one top-down organization. It's actually, we're a collection of brothers and sisters who are working together in our own neighborhoods. But together we choose, because we want it to be a want to and not a have to, we choose to work together because we know how hard and difficult ministry in the city is. And so, and now each one of our pastors, they are so gifted in their own rights that they now contribute their own unique charisms to the whole. So one of our pastors just wrote a book on preaching because that's his heart and his love. And so, man, we're sending all of our preachers to him to get trained. One of our churches, the person who started in Jersey City, he's incredibly gifted with creative arts. And he's someone who's constantly resourcing our churches in that end. His name's Craig Opala. And so I think now there's a relational connectivity that's been embedded in our culture. And so our pastors spend about 10 hours a month together, even though we're independent churches. So I think that goes to show that relationship is really what binds us together.
Nice. Good. We're coming up out of time here, but I want to just remind everyone, if Brooks, if you'd put up that graphic to remind everybody, Drew is actually speaking in DC and New York City. I think I said a minute ago incorrectly that you were not. Drew is speaking in DC and New York City. These are the lists of Exponential regionals. He's already spoken in Orlando. Actually, your team is hosting the New York City regional, Drew, so we're super excited about that as well, running logistics and more. We've had you together connected as well with us in New York City. We brought our church planning leadership fellowship there. Jordan has spoken in Orlando and is speaking at the New York City regional. Paul is speaking at the New York regional, bringing a group there as well. So we've got a great team that are coming. Let me remind you, if you're watching on Facebook Live, like and share. This is Exponential Backstage. My guests, Drew, Jordan, and Paul, are all church planners in New York City. And as we close, what I'd like to ask you to do is just to start in the order that's on my screen, which I don't know if you see, but it's Paul, Drew, and Jordan. Just kind of give us a closing word and a closing exhortation towards multiplication from what you've seen and what you learned. Just a couple minutes each, and then we'll wrap up our program today. Start with you, Paul, then Drew, then Jordan. Just go right through. Well, how would you exhort the people who are watching?
Sure. So a couple of days ago, I started reading the book of John over again. And I got to the bit where John the Baptist says, behold the Lamb of God. And it says 2 of his disciples went off and followed Jesus. And I got to thinking firstly about how secure John must have been as a leader to understand his mission, just to release people to what was the mission, which is following Jesus, not just following him. But then I noticed the question that Jesus asked them when they woke up is, what do you want? And I just got to think about what an insightful question that is. and wondering if we ask that question enough. So if you're wrestling with multiplication thinking and being an empowering leader, I guess my question, I think the Jesus question for you is, what do you want? Like, what do you really want? Because often there's a gap between what we say is our vision and actually what motivates us and deeply drives us. So what do we really want? Like, when it comes down to it, what are we willing to pay a price for? What moves us deeply? What do we get excited or angry about? Because it's on that level that real multiplication thinking has to come, because it's expensive. It's costly. It's costly, not just, we think about the finance, but it's costly to say goodbye to people that you love and release them to the calling. We don't talk nearly enough about the grief aspect of church planting a lot of times. So to me, it really comes down to a kind of a deep vision level as well. I know for us as a church, we've never planted because we looked at a heat map and said, there's a bunch of people over there, we should do something. It's, it's never been because our services were overflowing in the sense of it's never just been practical. In other words, for us, it's always been a vision thing. We see a calling on someone, God has a heart for a neighborhood, and we end up in places as random as Manzini in Southern Africa. You can't strategize that stuff. But it comes out of, I think, a deep answer to the question of, what do you really want? And I think when we settle that in our hearts as leaders, then we become safe hands for all kinds of things that only God can get the glory for.
Good word. A couple of minutes from you, Drew.
Yeah, I would say, I think when most people think about multiplication, I think they think about like this insatiable drivenness to grow and to expand. And obviously that's part of it in terms of fulfilling the Great Commission. But I think the subversive reason for multiplication for me is recognizing my own humanity. I mentioned earlier 2 different seasons of burnout, which really left me in a place of coming to face with my own mortality. And so in a subversive way, I think one of the best reasons to multiply is to say, hey, if I were to die today, would whatever I have been part of in creating and building and shaping, would it be able to last beyond me? And, God forbid that would happen. But I think it's this idea that I'm going to die one day, and it might be tomorrow. It might be next week. And what would it look like if I were to build something that would last beyond me? And I think multiplication thinking, it starts with this very human reality that I am not the hero, like this whole kind of thing is about. I am not the center of the universe. I am not the one whose name will live on forever and ever. It'll be the name of Jesus. And if that's the case, then how do I live my life in such a way that I am dispensable? And so I think that's one of the biggest lessons for me and then how can I live a healthy life so that I live in such a way that I'm giving away power because I realize I'm a dispensable person.
That's a good word. Jordan, last word.
Yeah, I'm actually, my little brother in the ministry, Kenneth Hart, he planted the Gathering Church, and we helped him get off, and he preached at Renaissance one Sunday, and it was a day of great joy and also some tension inside of me because I knew I was going to be standing on stage, putting my hand on his shoulder and saying, hey, if, Kenny just tore it down, and we would love for some of you guys to leave with him. And one of the things he said in the sermon was, it's amazing what can get done if nobody cares who gets the credit. And when he said that, I was, needed to hear that. But B, in the years since we've really got into really trying to be a blessing to other people, to sin radically, I've seen, quite honestly, it's amazing what can get done if nobody cares who gets the credit. Or, the amount of what we can get done in New York City, it's so monumentally more if we don't care about who gets the credit, whose name is on the front of the building, who's on the website, who's on a different list for fastest growing church or whatever. So, and I've just seen that happen in my own life. I've seen that happen in Harlem in the short time that we've been sewing together with other churches and thinking not just about ourselves, but other people. So.
It's a good word. It's a good word. Well, thank you, all 3 of you. And we love what you're doing in New York City, including in New Jersey. Don't send us letters about New Jersey. We love New Jersey too. But we just had a little fun, little heritage and history. There's a reason there. But so thankful for the 3 of you, for your work, not just there in the city, but as you're being used by God to multiply literally around the world. And so we're going to continue to pray with you. Looking forward to hearing you at the Exponential Regionals. Brooke, slow that up one more time so people can know where that is and connect with them there as well. And as you do, let me encourage you, go to the Exponential website, and you can find lots of resources there, exponential.org, lots of resources about church planning as well. My name's Ed Stetzer. My guests have been all church planners in New York City to help us talk about multiplication. And thank you for joining us for this webinar here in partnership with Exponential Backstage, live here from the Send Institute. Thanks. God bless. Share, like, and share so people can be benefited from this new resource. God bless.